Hi, I'm Regan Robinson, your host of Future Fit, the only podcast unraveling the secrets of how the world's most innovative leaders stay future ready in a fast-paced world. I've spent over 20 years as a futurist and strategist, transforming top global brands and putting investment-backed startups on paths to sustainable growth. Along the way, I've become obsessed with new ways to prepare for the future, because thinking about the long term once a year simply isn't enough. In each episode, I talk with movers, shakers, and path breakers who share their stories about how they turn uncertainty into their strategic advantage. Throughout our journey, we'll discover unconventional and imaginative ways to help you thrive today while leading your teams into tomorrow. Future Fit leaders know that being prepared for what's next is more than a business decision. It's a way of being. Let's venture together as we co-create a new future readiness playbook. The future can't wait, and neither can I. So, are you ready to get future fit? So today I'm thrilled to welcome Caroline McCarthy, a storytelling-driven marketer and media futurist who's currently working at the greatest advertising company on the planet. Caroline is known for writing advertising's next chapter as Vice President of Marketing at Infillion, an award-winning full-service technology platform that helps advertisers elevate their media plans. Infillion is trusted by the world's top agencies such as Ogilvy, Omnicom, and Havas, and was recently named to Fast Company's prestigious list of the world's most innovative companies of 2024, an award that shines a spotlight on companies that are shaping industry and culture through innovations. Caroline is also an alumna of the TED Residency Program, as well as Forbes 30 Under in media. Caroline is someone who's at the forefront of what's next, and so I'm incredibly excited to learn more about how she approaches her work. Welcome to the show, Caroline.
Thank you so much. I'm excited.
Marvelous. It's great to have you here. So I would love to begin our conversation with a question that I pose to all of my guests, and that is, what does future ready mean to you?
I think it's a really interesting question because for me, being future ready effectively means living in the present so that you're not just trying to catch up to the moment that you live in. Because if that's your natural state and you're struggling to catch up and you're not on top of what's in your life and in your work and you can't seem to hold things together in the present, then there's absolutely no way you're ready for the future. And so I think that's the most key component to it, because in a sense, you never can be fully future ready because you don't know what's going to happen. So I think it's your ability to be on top of the present moment. That's what positions you best for being ready for the future.
Yeah, and that's really insightful, and I couldn't agree more, where there's this centeredness that happens, especially when you're taking care of yourself and you're prioritizing your well-being, that is all connected to being in the present, because you have to cultivate the conditions to see this way and to think this way. And if you're not really rooted in the present moment, how are you going to anticipate what the future's possibilities are? Because you're not going to be as attuned to what's happening or what's going on.
No, absolutely. And I think that you're just not, I'm going to sound like someone who's just preaching the gospel of meditation here, but you're not present. You're not situated either mentally or emotionally or even physically where you need to be. And if you are living with that urge of feeling like you just have to catch up to the present moment, then there's no way you can get past that and be ready for the future. And I've been in that position. And honestly, it's only been very recently in my life that I've really been able to feel like, okay, yes, I am existing in the present so that I can be ready for the future.
Yeah. So as a trained transcendental meditationist, you and I could talk about meditation all day long.
Yes, we could. We totally could.
But it is a core component of my practice as well. Now, I'm not full TM these days, but I still use my mantra on a daily basis, even for a few moments, just to center myself. So I think that's a really good segue to my next question. So as I like to say, future readiness is a state of being. So It's not just about possessing knowledge and skills and capabilities, although that's part of it, but it's about cultivating a mindset that embraces change, innovation, lifelong learning, and diversity of thought and getting outside your comfort zone are critical to really effectively thinking about the future. And so what are some ways that you get your mind ready for future-oriented, exploratory, and imaginative thinking?
Sure. So the one thing that this is going to sound really ridiculous, but one thing that's been really key for me is that I had to learn, again, relatively late in life. I was definitely in my 30s by this point, that I had to learn how to listen. And I think that comes from the fact that I had a very traditional upbringing, 10 years of Catholic school. I associated listening with subservience because children were obligated to listen to adults, but the reverse was not true. And so if you were a kid who wanted to somehow be independent, number one thing was don't listen to authority figures. And I internalized that a little too well. And I was well into the working world when I realized that I think there were signals I just wasn't picking up on, and I hadn't cultivated an ability to listen. I was frequently distracted. Getting diagnosed with ADHD really helped me understand that there was not something horribly fundamentally wrong with me, that I just had to learn to live with a different kind of brain, and to realize that listening is a two-way process. You're not being lectured to. It's a key component of a balanced dialogue. And then the other thing that really has been key for me has been surrounding myself with other people who are like-minded in wanting to anticipate and help shape the future. And I have to do this much more assertively now because I live in a small town. I'm glad that we're doing this interview at 1 p.m. because around 3 p.m. my Wi-Fi is going to start to lag because our town is small, our bandwidth is limited.
Wow.
And when kids start coming home from school and playing video games, I can't hold a Zoom.
Oh my God.
Yes, it's a small place. And so I no longer have the privilege of just running into someone at a bar in New York and randomly hearing about the next big thing, which I think that's something that a lot of people who've been real proponents of innovation in New York have said, you don't get that in even the Bay Area, even in LA, where you're pretty much living out of your car on your commute every day. New York really is a hub for creative collisions. And I have to be really intentional about ensuring that those collisions still happen in my life, and surrounding myself with people who are also excited about the future and who want to shape it. The caveat there is, and this is where I think a lot of people fall short in being future ready, is that you're like, okay, like-minded people, they're going to be just like me, right? And they end up not just in groupthink, but also in professional insularity.
Right.
I worked at Google for a couple of years and I loved it. But previously, I'd been a journalist. And my entire job was to be running around New York, interviewing startup founders, talking to people who were building, talking to people who were investing. And I was just surrounded by ideas all the time. Google, even in New York, is a very insular company. You walk into Google's HQ, they pretty much the only building they had then was the big 111 8th Avenue, massive, size of a city block. And you don't leave. They feed you. All your coworkers are there. All your meetings are there. And I had worked there for maybe 6 months or so. And I was like, I don't hear about what's new anymore. I only hear about what's going on here.
Yeah.
And I think that when you look sometimes at the problems that, and I left Google over a decade ago, so I haven't been there in a while, but if you look at some of the problems that they faced in the past couple of years, a lot of it, I think, has come from not having those outside signals. And so I think that's something, making sure that you're not surrounding yourself just with people who do the same thing you do. I'll give a shout out to, I've been actually much longer than I've been involved in TED. I've been involved in Summit Series, actually went to my first Summit event in 2008, so over 15 years ago. And I'm active on pretty much a daily basis in their community WhatsApp groups. And the thing that I really love about Summit is that everyone, I was talking with someone else who's an attendee who actually lives in one town over from me, which is great because I feel most of the time I'm in the middle of nowhere. But I was talking to her and we were trying to explain Summit to someone else. And we were like, everyone has vibes. everyone is very curious, very open-minded, very accepting, but we don't necessarily all do the same thing. There might be people
Right.
there who work in commercial real estate by day or in finance by day, but they're also still interested in transcendental meditation and sound healing and biohacking and things like that, that they're really thinking about more futuristic ideas and ways of operating. And so I think that one of the things that makes them so valuable is that you show up and you go to one of their events, and the people who are there don't initially seem useful to you, but it turns out to be an incredibly useful event for you because you get so many outside perspectives that you wouldn't get.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Yeah, it sounds like the outside for you, if I could sum up the key points that are important for you, is one, this outside in perspective, right?
Yes.
Like narrowcasting and focusing on the familiar is one of the things that I see leaders make that mistake all the time.
Oh yeah.
I think listening is super important. It's but are we really listening? And then I think, as you said, being intentional. You have to, because of where you are location wise, you have to be a bit more intentional about how you bump up against the other or the unknown. But that, it sounds, are three things that you do to help you see and sense what the future's possibilities are. So I think that's a good segue into my next question. So as William Gibson famously said, the future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed. And so that quote really resonates with me in my work as a futurist because it underscores that the future is right in front of us if we're really looking. And so to our point, right? And emerging signals, which are specific examples of how the world could one day different, are everywhere. Now, in your work, you sniff out trends, as you say, which I love the metaphor of smelling. I think it's actually a really great illustration of what we're talking about. And you're looking at the nuances and the transitions and the inflection points of trends. And so how do you approach sniffing out trends? And what guidance could you share with leaders who want to use trends more strategically when preparing for the future?
Sure. So everybody likes to say that, especially these days, they like to say that curiosity is one of their core business values. A lot of the time they're saying it and they're not really living that value.
Yeah.
Because with genuine curiosity, you have to be willing to be curious about things that make you pretty uncomfortable and that maybe on the surface don't seem like they're good for your business at all. And so I'll give you a very recent example. So one thing that I would say maybe a year or two ago, Infillion purchased a small AI software company called Phonic. And it was so small that we literally purchased it right out of Y Combinator. I was not involved in the deal, so I can take no credit here. But Phonic does survey technology, including video and voice, where the AI component of it is that it analyzes the sentiment. And admittedly, those of us internally at Infillion, we reacted, oh, how's this going to integrate into our business?
Yeah, how's it going to pan?
Yeah, exactly.
It sounds like you're looking for, in terms of how you spot trends, or what you're looking for is you're actually maybe looking for an outlier or an anomaly or a data point that doesn't maybe make sense in terms of, that's one way that you sniff.
Or even not data points, things that could be data points if you got the data to back them up and verify them. I think that
or even an insight.
The insights and the anecdotes, I think are generally, I like to look into them in part because I'm a lifelong skeptic. And so when someone says something that they claim they know to be true, I want to look into whether it's actually true or not.
I love that. Lifelong skeptic. Yeah. That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I think what you're saying is really important. I actually have a shorthand for it. So whether it's a data point or it's more of a feeling. I like to channel the 1990 CNC Music Factory song, "The Things That Make You Go, And I use this song in my, I sing it in my head to really evoke the feeling of something is interesting here. Like something doesn't make sense.
And that helps
Yep.
me get intentional about noticing exactly what you're talking about, which is insight, data, info, a feeling, whatever
Yeah.
it could be that potentially warrants further investigation or asking more questions, right?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's dig into consumer research a bit more because I know you put out a lot of reports. I've actually really enjoyed and
Yeah.
learned quite a bit from the new sports fan as one example. So I often share with leaders that strategic foresight, which is the discipline I use to help brands strategize for their future, is I have to remind them that it's not extended market research. And that's
Right.
because you can't just ask a bunch of people what they want for the future, right?
Right.
Instead, you've got to support leaders to imagine potential futures that are complex and not
Hmm.
always positive or negative. And there's a diverse view of the future that I help them step into, hear and share perspectives on and make sense of so that they can understand what it might mean for them. As someone who's steeped in consumer research and puts out numerous reports, I'm curious. How are you using research to get insights into what Infillion's customers might need in the future? And how do you balance research-based insights with creative thinking or other forms of insight, like we're talking about, to approach your long-term marketing strategies?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, we have a whole research team, and it's something that we're really proud of. And
Mm-hmm.
even before we'd acquired this research tool, they were deploying surveys and trying to figure out what consumers want in the moment compared to maybe what they would have answered to the same question a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And for example, when things were peak COVID, our research team was deploying surveys on a very regular basis about what people said that they would be comfortable doing at a certain point and how that changed over the course of like 2020, 2021. And we did not, this was not intended to be made public, but it was intended to have on hand to show our clients, okay, this bodes well or this bodes not so well for there were so many verticals that were not sure how much ad spending they should put out. Would you really want to be advertising holiday travel if you're not sure if people are going to be traveling for the holidays? And
Mm-hmm.
I think that, and our head of research is a guy named Jamie, and I've worked with him for over 10 years now. And he is even more of a skeptic than I am. And I love that he always gives you these caveats with research.
Mm-hmm.
For example, certain mediums for research are more likely to get particular kinds of respondents. At a certain point, a lot of people's accuracy in terms of how they answer a question starts to drop off. If you're asking more than X number of questions, the later questions, the responses might not be as accurate because people just get me to the end. And then also you look at past patterns and how they change leading up to the present, but they might not continue on that same line in the future. And so I think
Mm-hmm.
it's as much about looking at what the research says, but also looking at how the research was conducted and what was going on when the research was conducted. So
Yeah, the
the data
context.
points are awesome. Yeah, the data points are awesome, but you have to look at so much context.
Yeah. And I think also you were just talking about patterns of human behavior. And so that's another important element. You have to really look at things holistically, I think is what you're saying, as
Absolutely.
opposed to
Yeah.
looking at in isolation.
Mhm.
And so I'm curious, how do you, because you do a lot of research and you have a whole team that does it, like how do you ensure that your research remains adaptable and relevant as new customer trends and preferences emerge? Do you have any tips or secrets you could share besides doing it all the time,
Um,
right?
yeah, I think that my colleagues who orchestrated the purchase of Phonic were really being savvy when they made that purchase because historically research insights that have that are relevant to advertisers, they're coming from people clicking through surveys, and
Mm,
Phonic's technology can actually give the option of voice responses, and then it creates these like tag clouds with the words that came up most as well as sentiment for each question. And I think that broadens the base of people who are willing to respond, especially younger people who are used to responding to things with voice memos and like immediate TikTok reaction videos and things like that. where that might be a more natural behavior than clicking a few buttons. And so I think that being able to adapt how you gather research is really key. I would definitely have to ask more from the folks who actually conduct these for us as to whether they look at different ways of
I think the specifics aren't necessarily germane to everyone, but I think what you hit on was really important is you have to look at it from the perspective of updating your inputs, right? That's how you can, that's the lens or the framework that can help keep it fresh, which I think is really insightful. So let's shift gears to the topic of innovation. So you recently posted about a conversation that Infillion CMO had at Advertising Week New York that helped you see a new side of what it means to innovate and the unusual places that it can come from. And your takeaway was, I'm paraphrasing here, but I really liked it. It's not always about being the first mover, and that a fresh perspective from a seasoned player can redefine industry standards. And why that really resonated with me is fresh perspectives are essential for seeing and seizing the future's possibilities because they challenge existing assumptions and expand the range of potential opportunities. So as someone who is really intentional as you are in terms of how you move through the world, what unusual or even overlooked sources of innovation have you discovered recently? And how would you advise leaders to tap into these to disrupt maybe some conventional group thinking that may be happening?
Oh, that's a great question. So the conversation that you mentioned was something, that we hosted at Advertising Week New York, and our one of our company leaders, Laurel Rossi, was talking with an exec from Albertsons Media Collective, which is the advertising and retail media arm of Albertsons, which is a grocery store chain that has existed since the 1940s. And retail media has become one of the hottest topics in advertising because, as you know, but listeners might not, third-party data in the form of browser cookies is being deprecated at some point. I say at some point because it was supposed to start and then it started and then it stopped and it's the big soap opera and stuff like that. But retail media, so the amount of data that retailers, including brick and mortar retailers, have on their customers is phenomenal. And one of the advantages that Albertsons had is that they had been very slow to digital. And the reason why that's an advantage and not a disadvantage is because they hadn't built up all these legacy systems that they then had to adapt to an era where retail media data is a powerful news source for advertisers. They were able to just build it from the start.
Right.
Basically.
Yeah. Don't underestimate the power of a blank piece of paper.
Exactly.
Canvas.
Yeah, and it's parallel to when you look at the countries around the world that were much faster to smartphone adoption than in the US. And it's a lot of countries that we would think of as, developing countries. And that's because they didn't necessarily have the landlines. They went straight to cell phones. They went straight to streaming because they didn't have cable. And so I think that there's the potential for innovation where you don't have to upend a legacy system is something that you really can't ignore. But I also think that you can look at companies that kind of are known for being edgy innovators and looking at whether they do that well. I think that sometimes as an external onlooker, you aren't necessarily privy to the strategy. And I'll give you another example from Google, and actually in this case, Google doing something very well is that when early in my career, I was a journalist. And I sometimes covered Google. And one thing that kept happening was Google kept shutting down all these smaller products that it had. And the narrative in the press was just always like, what's wrong with Google that they're doing this? And it was honestly a little bit reactionary, a little bit hyperbolic, but it was external media very curious about these big tech companies. So of course that was our perspective. But then once I actually started working at Google, that process of shutting down products and initiatives and things like that was seen as completely normal because it was like, well, if it's not working, or maybe it was never intended to be long term, but we were trying to get different insights out of this to build something else.
Prototype.
It was seen as it was seen as totally normal. And I think that the ability to stop something when it's not working isn't the sign necessarily of a failed gamble at innovation. I think that a company like Google really got tons of incredible insights out of that. Another example I really like to use is that I think it was 2009, PepsiCo, which had already started building up a big reputation among kind of early social media pundits and onlookers as a company that really wanted to be seen as very future forward. 2009, they made a big announcement that they were not running a Super Bowl ad, and that instead they were going to be putting that budget towards social media initiatives and campaigns on those platforms. And the next year they were back to doing a Super Bowl ad. And so there was the immediate reaction, again, in the press rather than among the people who were working on this day to day. The immediate reaction was like, oh wow, social media is not the marketing brand goldmine that Pepsi thought it was.
Right.
But actually, when they were in a situation where they were so early to these new platforms, they got that test bed and they were ready when those were mainstream. And I think that it was probably, and I've never worked there, but it was probably an incredibly valuable experiment for them.
Yeah, when it sounds like one thing that you do when you're looking for sources of information is that you're also looking what those innovative companies are doing, or tests that might be happening in the marketplace, and irrespective of whether it's perceived as a success or not, that again, your like spidey sense might be up, and you're like, ooh, okay, there might be something interesting happening over here that could be something that we can apply to our own business, which I think is really important, because invention and innovation are actually not the same thing, right? Originality and innovation. And so innovation can be applying something in an entirely new context. And so I think that's really insightful for people to keep in mind.
Yeah, I think that one thing that, especially in the marketing world, if people and brands want to really be future ready, they can't be afraid to be seen as pulling back on things. Because if you release something as a test, as an experiment to see how people mess with it, the public is going to interpret that as a mainstream product launch. Maybe not. I hope that's changing, because you have a digitally native generation that are now, adults with incomes and buying power. And they grew up in the era of limited edition product drops and pop-up retailers and things like that. And so I think that sense of permanence may be eroding. But I think that you have to be, if you're testing something out, you have to be comfortable with the fact that there are always going to be people who think it's not a test. And then when it ends, they're going to be like, oh, I guess it failed.
Right.
But that's not a reason to not do it.
Yeah, exactly. You've got to be bold and have confidence in what you're doing. And guess what? Not every test is going to work out, right? That's
exactly
that's part of innovation. So I think that's a good transition to my final question before we wrap up. So the marketing landscape as evolves quickly, driven by changes in media consumption, consumer behavior, global trends, things like that. And it's really this constant flux that makes it difficult to anticipate the future and create long-term strategies. There's also information overload, which makes separating the signal from the noise a tough task. So for example, I read the 5 biggest tech trends at Possible 2024 piece, and it highlighted that marketers have a ton of data, but they don't know what to do with it. I happened to come across a 2022 survey of 300 CMOs globally who revealed that 2/3 feel overwhelmed by the volume of data that they deal with.
Oh, yeah.
And that the average number of data sources has doubled in 2 years. So I'm like, thank God I'm not a CMO anymore, but regardless, there's a lot going on. And so what gaps or difficulties are you facing when strategizing for Infillion's long-term marketing strategy? So as a company, and what advice would you offer for leaders who are struggling with similar challenges?
So, yeah, I'm going to answer that on a note that's a little bit more personal than on a company note. And I think that it makes a broader point, which is that there's a real kind of push-pull with the need to stay informed and future ready. And then the fact that information overload is not good for our brains. And I think that we're starting to realize that. I think especially the concept of news overload and device overusage and They now say, you're not supposed to look at your phone right before you go to bed because it can actually disrupt your sleep to look at a bright screen. And so immersing yourself in excessive information, especially like really urgent up to the moment information is not good for your brains.
Right.
And I think that the answer that a lot of marketers, and here I'm getting back to the business case, the answer that a lot of marketers have had for this is that, oh, we just outsource it all to AI. The listening tools and the machine learning can sort through this data and tell us everything. But then you're missing the human component. I think that you have to be mindful of the fact that being always on and being constantly surrounded by signals, by information, by noise, that's not good for your mental health. But at the same time, I don't think it's beneficial to completely turn it all over to an algorithm that's going to assess what's best for you, because I think then, you're missing the human component.
That's certainly important. We can't forget the human component. And I think the information overload, what was coming up for me is this massive influx of data leads to analysis paralysis also, where we, tend to overanalyze every statistic, and it slows down decision making.
Yeah. The more data you have, the more you can potentially manipulate it to suit your own goals. The classic analogy here that comes up in a lot of biohacking surveys is that you can find, or not surveys, and in a lot of biohacking conversations and stuff, is that you can find a study that will tell you that coffee will add 10 years to your life, and you can find a study that will tell you coffee will make you drop dead.
Right.
There is research that is all over the place, tons of differences in how the controls are done, but you can still come to wildly different conclusions from it. And so that's why I think that the more data you have, the more easily it can be manipulated. And that's why you need to add in that component of human curiosity, but also skepticism alongside whatever machine learning you're using to process through all this data.
Yeah. And traditional data sources often fail to capture the full spectrum of human behavior. So that additional component is really important. And not all data noise is bad noise too. As we were talking about earlier, sometimes seemingly irrelevant information can uncover hidden insights. And so one thing that I practice in my life is when there are times when, I might even overload myself on information, maybe like a information overload sprint, if you will, where you actually deliberately explore data from random or unconventional sources, maybe to do some pattern recognition. But then to your point earlier, then I pause, step away, take care of myself. I actually call them rest and digest, right? Because then again, this is where the human element comes in. Then you might have a different perspective on all this info that you're gathering now that you've taken a moment or longer to pause. I'm also a big fan of slow marketing, right? And taking a step back,
totally
resisting the pressure to respond instantly to every data point, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So is there anything else you'd like to add before we bring our conversation to a close?
I'm very honored that you approached me about this, and I'm very, very glad to be here. And I think that, really, to sum things up, really leaning into actual curiosity, not just buzzword curiosity, but getting curious about the things that might not seem like they're good and the things that might make you uncomfortable to think about. I think that's really key to being future ready, but also just the key to being future ready is being able to exist in the present.
Yeah, love that. Beautiful. So a final question before you share where listeners can find you. So in your view, is preparing for the future more about managing risks or capitalizing on opportunities?
Ooh, that's a really good question, especially since I think they're not necessarily two different things. I think that if you're capitalizing on an opportunity, there are a lot of risks you have to manage in the process. And I think sometimes there's more of one and sometimes there's more of the other, but they're definitely not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, I love that. And with that, where can people go to find out more about you and your work?
So the company I work for, Infillion, is infillion.com. And for me personally, I have very short username on Instagram and Twitter. It's Caro. I kind of beta tested both of them.
Wow.
I've been on the internet for a long time. I'm excited to continue this kind of conversation.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time and your brilliant insights, Caroline. It's been enlightening and I've had so much fun exploring with you.
I have had a blast with this. And once again, thank you.
Thank you. The honor was mine.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Future Fit. If you're listening, you're probably future curious. So follow me in my newsletter on LinkedIn to keep the conversation going and share your discoveries with the Future Fit community. And if you enjoyed this episode, remember to subscribe, rate, and review Future Fit on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time.